Welcome to part 3 of this series. In this series, we look at starting an Admech army from the very beginning to your first 2,000 point army list. In this video, we'll cover the Forge Worlds that we didn't cover in the previous video, which have not seen tournament play as a detachment on their own. And once again, I'd like to remind everyone that just because something hasn't seen tournament play does not mean that it cannot see successful tournament play in the future or be successful at all. The main reason that I reference tournaments in these videos is because it's the easiest baseline to determine, whereas other modes of play are subjective in nature and can range from player to player. This does not mean that what I cover here is not applicable to other types of games or narrative play or anything of that nature. It simply means that it takes a little bit more of a focus from a certain baseline than others. Before I begin this video, I'd like to address a couple errors that I made in part 2. Obviously, I made an error with the Mars stratagem, which I mentioned in the video and put a correction in the video section as opposed to the audio. However, I did make another error that was very significant, and that error is the Styges 8 stratagem has changed from the one printed in the codex. The new Styges 8 stratagem does not change what was said in the video, but does change how the stratagem works. The new stratagem you'll see on screen does not allow for an infiltration play, but rather allows for a turn 1 move of a unit already deployed. This move is restricted to 9 inches and has to end 9 inches away from an enemy unit after it happens. The major thing about this that still keeps Fulgurites and Dune Riders as their key unit is that now you can move embarked vehicles. As such, this stratagem plays a bit differently than it did before, and it's important to make that distinction. It does not change the favored units, nor how you would structure a Styges 8 army. Anyway, let's move on to the video itself. The first Forge World on this list is not an actual Forge World, but rather something different. The name I'll give this is Super Friends or Captain Planet. The reason for this name is that it brings together many different Forge Worlds, combines their powers, and plays as one. There are two different ways of playing this Forge World in a given list. The first method is taking separate detachments, such as one detachment being completely made up of Data Horde, and the second detachment being completely made up of Mars units. That way you get two detachments which gain benefits from both Forge Worlds, but are distinctly unique. In this case though, I'd like to focus more on a different way of playing this, and that's taking a single detachment with different Forge Worlds mixed into that detachment. In the previous video, I mentioned that there was a list that had placed within a tournament that uses second strategy, and it was something I hadn't really considered. And many other people probably haven't considered it either. So let's take a look at what you gain and what you lose for going down this route. What you give up is the dogma within that detachment for any Forge World you've taken. In some cases, this might actually be a reasonable loss. In other cases, this might not matter quite so much. What you're really gaining is the ability to access different stratagems for different Forge Worlds, as any unit of a specific Forge World can access their specific stratagem. This means that when you're playing in this style, that you're looking for Forge Worlds with particularly strong stratagems. In many cases, Forge Worlds that would otherwise not see play but have a strong stratagem can see play in this style of list, as all of a sudden they contribute something very powerful without necessarily forcing you to commit to an entire detachment of that specific Forge World. As such, you're looking at Forge Worlds like Gria and Riza, which have very powerful stratagems but are not particularly strong overall. And the reason this is important for this video is because many of the Forge Worlds in the top half of this video will have a strong stratagem but not be particularly strong on their own, and as such are good to mix into a detachment such as this. You can even take some of the Forge Worlds from the top 4 and mix them into detachments such as this, because some of them have powerful stratagems as well, such as Styges 8, Mars, and Lucius, as you can give various units their stratagem and still make use of it. Though as you're focusing on stratagems to play in this style, this kind of list becomes very command point intensive, and as such, that is another downside to playing in this style. So it's not all upside and it's not all downside. It's simply a choice made by the player. For those thinking this potentially breaks narrative play or isn't conducive to the lore, rest assured there are actually many cases of this happening. Such as in the case of Triplex Fall, which does not have Forge World mechanics within the game, is a Forge World that is mistrusted by Mars because they withhold information, and as such Mars has sent several legions to watch over Triplex Fall and report back. Though this has worked out for Triplex Fall because during this time they have been invaded by many enemy forces between orcs and Tyranids and even demons, and have used the Mars legions as part of their defense force. And in some cases, Like the Horus Heresy, Riza was a key defensive world for the Empire, and as such, many Forge worlds used it as a safe haven, fighting alongside Riza during the invasion that happened there. In other cases, such as the game Mechanicus, I believe that according to its lore, most of the tech priests on the ship are actually from Mars, but a tech priest such as Scavolia is clearly Styges 8, and she harbors many different Xenorite ideologies. So there are many instances where different Forge worlds come together and fight as either one band or different groups in their own detachments. The first real Forge world on the list is Gria. Gria is a Forge world that is made up of many small ships that can move as one big cluster, yet it is not necessarily certain how safe this movement would be, and Gria is a very stubborn Forge world, so it's unlikely that they really want to try fleeing in a given fight. To jump into it right away, what really makes Gria shine is their stratagem. What the stratagem states is that if a Gria infantry unit is within 24 inches of an enemy psyker, they can roll a die, and if the roll is successful on a 4+, that psychic power is denied. So that gives you a 50% chance to negate a psychic power. Something the Admech does not have is psykers. This gives them an ability to interact with the psychic phase in a way that many armies can't. And Admech already have a slight benefit to dealing with armies that have psychic powers because they can take Abhor the Witch as a secondary objective, which armies who have psykers cannot take. Knowing that this is Gria's main benefit and that it specifically works in infantry, this means that their core unit is actually the Skitarii Vanguard. The Vanguard are great objective holders while being inexpensive, and if you put 2 units of 5 in a Dune Rider, it makes them very good at simply being very resilient. The other unit that might work with Gria is the Corpus Carry Electro Priests, because they are also an infantry unit, and the Gria Warlord trait allows for units that are within 6 inches of the Warlord to essentially shoot in close combat. When you take the Vanguard, who has a -1 toughness debuff to enemy units within 1 inch, and you can shoot in close combat with either the Vanguard or the Corpus Carry, you're able to stack a lot of firepower on those. This is probably a little bit too niche, and it's not necessarily great because you're also paying for the Gria Warlord trait as you would take a Holy Order Warlord trait before you would take any of the normal traits. The reason the Vanguard are the core unit of the Gria Forge world and not the Corpus Carry is because of the dogma when considered if it's in use. What the dogma states is when a unit flees or is slain on a roll of 6, the unit refuses to yield and stays alive. As such, this is what disqualifies something like the Cataphrons or other multi-wound units who might still qualify as infantry from being the core unit, as well as other Forge worlds benefiting them a little more. What disqualifies the Corpus Carry is that this buff does not stack with abilities such as the Feel No Pain save. However, this dogma does come with a slight downside in that units affected by it cannot fall back if they have this unless there is a character present. That is a very corner case, so it is not something that makes or breaks the dogma in itself. The Gria Relic is particularly unimpressive as all it does is give you 1 extra command point. In the past, this might have been more useful where you gained command points based on the detachments you were taking. But in 9th edition, now that you actually lose command points for taking additional detachments, this probably isn't the most important one unless you're trying to get that 1 extra command point, at which point you might consider this, as our relics, as mentioned before, are not particularly great. As you might have noticed, all of the Gria abilities are not particularly the worst and might be playable. Where Gria really falls apart is on its Canticle. The Canticle might have been useful in 8th edition, but with 9th edition changes, the Canticle is almost unplayable, as it reads that you hit on 5 pluses instead of only 6 pluses when shooting Overwatch. Overwatch now costs command points as a stratagem, and as such, you can only use it on 1 unit, and it becomes very command point intensive. To wrap up the Gria Forge world, I'll say this much: it might be playable on its own, it's very close to it. The only thing holding it back is that all of the abilities are just on the slightly weak side of being particularly good. And as such, Gria ends up being one of those Forge worlds where you can take 1 or 2 units of Vanguard, put them in a detachment, lose the dogma you would normally gain otherwise, but benefit from being able to deny psychic powers, and some of the psychic powers can be very critical to deny. Maybe with some changes in the future, Gria can be a much stronger Forge world, as almost all of the abilities are almost there in terms of being very, very good, but fall slightly short of being good enough. Following Gria comes Riza. Riza was considered to be one of the strongest Forge worlds in the lore, as it created some of the most advanced plasma weaponry within the Empire. Not only that, but at one point, Riza actually rivaled Mars in importance and was considered to be overtaking Mars in the early days of the Imperium. So much so that when the Forge Master of Mars became a traitor to follow Horus during the Horus Heresy, Riza became the bastion of the Adeptus Mechanicus to defend against the Dark Mechanicus. If you're interested in more of the lore about the Horus Heresy and the war between Mars and Riza during that time period, I'll link a video down below by a YouTuber known as Luden09, which discusses the Titan warfare on Riza from invading Mars forces and what happened with the war on Riza from invading Dark Mechanicus forces. It's a great video and I would highly recommend listening to it. Like Gria, Riza has a very powerful stratagem. The Riza stratagem says that plasma weapons in a given squad gain +1 to wound and +1 damage. This buff is actually better than the overcharge ability on normal plasma weapons, because not only are you safe from overcharging your plasma weapons and killing the unit firing them, but you also gain +1 to wound, not +1 strength. This is a big difference because +1 to wound can take you over a certain threshold that +1 to strength may not. And with this, because the stratagem is so important, just like it is with Gria, we come to the core unit of Riza. The core unit is the Cataphron Plasma Destroyer, and the reason it's not the Vanguard is because while you can give Vanguard 2 plasma weapons, you don't get quite as many shots by just taking those, and you can't use them more than once, and it would be too command point intensive using it on Vanguard squads. While Cataphron Destroyers can all be armed with plasma weapons, and they benefit from it completely. The big thing that hurt the Cataphron Destroyer was the 9th edition change, which said that the model was destroyed on a natural roll of 1, as opposed to a 1 that could be modified. And as a result, you no longer have a safety on a weapon that can potentially have many shots. And because the model is destroyed, as opposed to taking a wound, you stand to lose all of the wounds on a Cataphron Destroyer instead of just 1. When we start to see issues with Riza is when we look at some of their other abilities, as many of their abilities favor melee instead of shooting like their stratagem. For example, their dogma benefits melee, and while this isn't the end of the world because a stratagem can only be used on 1 unit, it does bring into question what is this Forge world trying to do. Their special canticle, likewise, benefits melee once again by giving melee weapons an extra point of armor penetration. This isn't the worst either, and maybe there would be some build if there were more options for melee units within the Adeptus Mechanicus. The biggest issue with these is that the Rust Stalkers are not in a particularly good place, and the Dragoons have been made significantly weaker in the changes leading up to 9th edition. And while Fulgurites are still perfectly fine, they have better Forge worlds to be in as one of your only melee options. The Riza Warlord trait and the Riza Relic are both weapons and buffs to your Warlord specifically, and while they're not particularly bad in themselves, they're nothing particularly interesting either. And more importantly, the Relic only takes the Warlord strength from 6 to 7, which is a significantly less important threshold than going from 7 to 8 like you do with the Mars Canticle. I really wouldn't consider taking either of these unless you're going full Riza, just happen to throw them on while still getting the Holy Order Warlord trait. For the time being, it's probably best to simply keep Riza as a Splash Forge world where you bring in a unit of Cataphron Destroyers armed with plasma to get the stratagem from Riza and avoid using the other things until maybe Admech gets a few more melee options in order to allow that style of play. After covering Riza, we come to our first custom Forge world, which is the Rad Saturated Forge world. The lore for the Rad Saturated Forge world is rather scarce, and as you'll see with most custom Forge worlds, the name says it all, and in this case, it is a Forge world that is saturated with radiation. On occasion, is used as a bioweapon against its enemies during war. As it is a custom Forge world, all you get from it is the dogma, but the dogma has a primary and secondary option. This means that any custom Forge world is not a candidate for splashing within a detachment but can be taken as a detachment on its own. The primary half of the dogma is only okay, and it functions similar to the Styges 8 dogma in that any unit outside of 12 inches that is shooting at one of your units gains a debuff that gives them -1 to strength. This is only okay, and I would say what you're really looking with this Forge World, as with the Data Horde Forge World, is not at the primary, but actually at the secondary. There are 2 secondary options within the dogma that you can pick from in order to be optimal when picking this Forge World. The first is called Luminary Suffusion, and what it does is it takes any unit that has radium saturation and supercharges that ability to give any enemy units within 3 inches of that unit that debuff, which is significantly better than the normal -1 to toughness debuff that the Rad Saturated ability that your units carry. There are 2 reasons for this, because not only do you give -1 strength in addition to -1 toughness, but also because you can be 3 inches away, you can actually allow other friendly units to shoot at whatever you're debuffing, as opposed to having to be within 1 inch and being unable to shoot. Though there is a major drawback to this debuff, which is that only 2 units within the Admech have the Rad Saturated ability, which is the Vanguard and the Sulfur Hounds. So pretty much you're very heavily restricting yourself to using those units when picking this Forge World if you go with the secondary, and as such those would be your 2 primary units if you pick this Forge World. The other secondary that is pretty good within the Rad Saturated Forge World is the Scarifying Weapon secondary. What this does is it takes any radium weapon and gives it a -1 AP modifier. And really the only units that have this weapon are the Vanguard, so you're really restricting yourself to Vanguard when you're taking this ability. And while it's a very powerful ability in theory, and might actually give the Vanguard some punch because every single rad carbine they carry has 3 shots, it's still at a particularly low strength, and it's still not particularly that impressive. I really wish that you could take the first, secondary, and Scarifying Weapons as part of the same dogma so that you could take those and really make your Vanguard shine. However, maybe there is some justification to taking a very small detachment such as a patrol and filling it with Vanguard and Sulfur Hounds in order to gain the Luminary Suffusion in order to debuff other units while still having some decent shooting. And maybe there's even a world in which you can justify taking a detachment and filling it with Vanguard with Scarifying Weapons in order to optimize the number of shots you can get from them while also using them to secure objectives. I don't think that's good enough, or it will be good enough in the near future, but you never know how things might play out. And now we turn our attention to the Forge World of Agrippana. Agrippana is a Forge World that is the closest to the Eye of Terror, where all of Chaos essentially can emanate from into the rest of the galaxy. In the past, there was an Imperial Guard world which was closer to the Eye of Terror and acted as a gate between the Eye of Terror and the rest of the galaxy, known as Cadia. During one of the Black Crusades, Cadia fell, and as such, the inhabitants of Cadia fled and went to the closest Imperial world, which was Agrippana. And Agrippana welcomed them in the way Admech welcome anyone, in that if you wish to serve the Omnissiah, you're welcome to join. And as such, many of the Imperial Guard that came from Cadia became new converts to Agrippana, becoming Scutari, while in others becoming servitors, such as Cataphrons. Agrippana is a unique Forge World in that it has a stratagem that can range in command point cost depending on the power level of what you're bringing back. You can either bring back a unit of Cataphron Breachers or Cataphron Destroyers using the new recruits stratagem from Agrippana. The way this works is, as long as one unit remains within the squad, you can take it off the board and bring back the entire squad as a reserve. The biggest issue with this is, if the squad is wiped out, you can no longer use this stratagem on that squad, and this is very vulnerable to an opponent that knows how to play around it. One thing I'll mention is that power levels have been changed in 9th edition, such that it has buffed the Cataphron Breachers so that you can bring significantly more Breachers back, but the Cataphron Destroyer power level change did not affect the number of Cataphron Destroyers you can bring back. On screen, you'll see a graph that shows how many units you can bring back with either Breachers or Destroyers based on power level using the stratagem and how many command points it will cost you. The Dogma of Agrippana is essentially what the Canticle was of Gria. And as I mentioned, the Canticle of Gria became almost unplayable when we moved to 9th edition. This could really use some kind of buff or some kind of change, because as it sits now, there isn't enough justification to consider the Dogma of Agrippana, which makes it an okay splash option. And if you're taking Destroyers which would be one of the core units of Agrippana, you're probably better off taking Riza, or if you're taking Breachers, you're probably better off taking Data Horde Forge World. Maybe there's some option by taking Torsion Cannon Breachers or Heavy Grav Cannon Destroyers, though the Torsion Cannon Breachers are not in a particularly good place, and while Grav Cannon Destroyers are perfectly fine, there's probably better ways of playing them than in Agrippana. So maybe there is some playability to the stratagem. You're usually probably better off taking a different option. The Warlord trait is one of those things you maybe will consider, but all it does is reduce the damage your Warlord takes by 1 to a minimum of 1, and as I mentioned, you'll only really be taking this if you spend command points because the Holy Order Warlord traits are so much significantly better and cannot be taken with command points. The Canticle for Agrippana is not necessarily bad, but it's nothing to write home about either. What it does is when a model dies, it can shoot one of its weapons or make one of its attacks with a melee weapon on a roll of a 5+. Kind of situational, but maybe if you can convince an opponent to shoot at one of your squads of destroyers, get a few extra shots off, and then resurrect it using the new recruit's ability, you can get something from it, though that's all very cute and not very practical. And what you get from the relic is sort of a Dealosis ability in that the Warlord can pick a vehicle within 18 inches in line of sight, and any units that shoot at that vehicle can reroll ones, sort of like a Dominus would buff, or if it's a Chaos vehicle, can reroll anything such as a Call buff. It's interesting, but it's too weak, and it's just not good enough to make up for all of the other flaws. Again, maybe someone can figure out something with this Forge World, but I would really not rank it highly. Now, on the bottom of the list are 2 Forge Worlds that aren't particularly impressive, and I can't imagine even splashing these. The first on this list is the Expansionist Custom Forge World. Once again, this is a custom Forge World, so all you get is a Dogma, so you can't really splash this one. So this removes the possibility of taking some of the units in another detachment. And as this is a custom Forge World, the name says it all, they like to expand. What is their primary buff from the Dogma? Well, on a charge or heroic intervention, their weapons gain -1 AP. That's great and all, but it sounds like a bad version of the Riza Canticle. I guess it's active every single turn, but why wouldn't you just go Riza? There are 3 potential secondaries that you can pick that are playable from this Forge World. In my opinion, they're all a bit limited, and I'll list them in no real order and kind of tell you what they do. The first is a Scout movement on Rangers that gives you a movement of 6 inches before the game starts. Maybe you can figure out something using the Arquebus with a lot of Ranger squads, but I don't really know how good this would be in comparison to what you're giving up to take this, especially since the primary really conflicts with what the secondary wants to do. Then there's the option of adding 6 inches to rapid-fire weapons, which is okay, I guess, but why not just take a Manipulus? It doesn't lock you into a Forge World, and it lets you kind of be more flexible with what you choose to do. And once again, adding range to your rapid-fire weapons kind of conflicts with what you're doing on your primary buff of trying to get into melee. Maybe you can argue that they were going for kind of a Stygies situation where you're encouraging people to get close to you so that you can benefit from your melee buff, but this really just doesn't do it. Not to mention that most of our weapons are heavy weapons, which is why the Mars Canticle is so good. You're really buffing kind of weak weapons by adding range to the rapid fire. And then there's the ability to remove the debuff from advancing with assault weapons. I guess that might be okay if you're taking a lot of Corpus Carry and Vanguard, but again, it's just not great. It's a cool name to a Forge World, but I feel like this Forge World was kind of rushed out or not thought about much, and none of the factors of it really mesh well together. And at the bottom of the list is the Forge World Metallica. The lore behind the Forge World Metallica is that they are very loud due to all of the metal music that they're constantly playing and disturbing their neighbors with. In reality, they're very loud not because of the metal music or anything else, but because of all the pistons and other sounds that are happening on their Forge World at all times. So in a way, they are very metal. unfortunately, despite their interesting name, really nice paint scheme, and interesting lore, they're actually a very weak Forge World at this time, and I can't really see a world in which they're worth taking over other options, because you can always paint your Forge World as Metallica and simply play it as a different Forge World, because most people won't recognize the difference between different paint schemes of Forge World unless they also play Adeptus Mechanicus. The best thing about the Metallica Forge World is probably their Canticle, which gives -1 to hit to enemies that are within 9 inches. It's sort of an inverse Stygies Dogma in that it works at close range, but not from a distance, and it can affect melee combat as well. It's an interesting ability, and I think it would be interesting to explore this one, but as a Canticle, you can only use it so much without spending command points, and it really forces you into being a Metallica Forge World. Maybe there's a world in where you take a detachment of Metallica in order to gain this Canticle for the rest of your units if your Warlord is from Metallica, but again, everything you give up is just too much. And talking about Dogma, the Dogma of Metallica is kind of like the Expansionist World Dogma in that you can advance with assault weapons, but it has the added benefit of making rapid-fire weapons function as assault weapons, in that they gain the penalty of an assault weapon when advancing, but that's not even good enough for the Expansionist Forge World. Why would it necessarily be good enough for Metallica? I guess you get more buffs from being a named Forge World as opposed to a custom one, though what are you really using this on? Maybe you can use it with Corpuscary Priests who are okay in close combat, though most things you're going to use this on isn't going to be that great. And when we look at the stratagem, there's no salvation there either, as all it does is give -1 leadership to enemy units within 6 inches of the unit you choose from Metallica. I mean, yeah, it's a cool name for stratagem. The Warlord trait is maybe another interesting point, because it gives them the ability to fall back and shoot. You know, that's interesting, but it's very restrictive due to having to be in range of your Warlord, and you can only make so much use out of it, whereas other armies have this ability in a little bit of more of a utility role. The Relic isn't anything great either. It's a strong melee weapon, and it can do a lot of work, but it's one attack, so what does it really accomplish? I don't know, I try to be very positive about all the different Forge Worlds, and while I can find most things that make Forge Worlds interesting, I don't really see it with the Expansionist and the Metallica Forge World. They're both in a very dire state despite being very interesting ideas. I hope that in the future they become significantly better, because right now it's not so much that they're a little weak, it's that so many of their benefits don't really contribute anything to what you're trying to accomplish, or contribute so little that it's almost negligible, whereas at least all of the other Forge Worlds have something that kind of draws you in and makes you want to play that Forge World. Because even the 2 Forge Worlds that are listed above them, such as Agrippana, can have something interesting by bringing back a large unit of Cataphrons, or the Rad Saturated, which has that very interesting debuff, can do something really interesting and impressive if given the chance, but it's too gimmicky, whereas Metallica and Expansionist, they don't have anything that's strong but boring, and they don't have anything that's flashy but inconsistent. They just have something that's not impressive at all, unfortunately. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And as always, if you like the video, please like and subscribe for future content, as it really helps a new channel like mine. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.